Brad Wilcox is professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, the Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. The author of Get Married, Why Americans Should Defy Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. Wilcox studies marriage, fatherhood, and the impact of strong and stable families on men, women, and children. Professor Wilcox is the author and co-author of 6 books and has written for scientific journals such as the American Sociological Review and the Journal of Marriage and Family, as well as popular outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and National Review.
Hey, great. Thanks, Kevin, for having us here this morning. As we get started with my talk, I want to just kind of begin with a question, and that is just to raise your hand if you would like to be happy. Okay, so obviously most folks here want to be happy. And the reason I asked that question, right, is because, you know, you're not alone. And we even know that our civilization is a nation dedicated, as Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, to the, quote, pursuit of happiness. This pursuit has been and remains fundamental to the American experience. And I have to confess, I'm kind of a little bit obsessed with Jefferson. Of course, I have my problems with Jefferson, but I live kind of under the shadow of Monticello, his home in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I teach at his university that he founded, the University of Virginia. So again, this issue of the pursuit of happiness is kind of important for a number of reasons for me as a scholar and as a person. And yet, when we look at the trends in the data, what we're seeing is that American happiness is falling, okay? It's coming down, as this Gallup poll indicates. Mark and I also track something called the General Social Survey, also kind of tells the same story. Again, happiness is down in America today. And maybe it's because we're pursuing the wrong things as a culture, as men and women also. Okay, maybe we're not really kind of heading towards the things that are most important when it comes to a flourishing and mostly happy life. My own thought is part of the problem is that our ruling class message or messages around kind of what's important are off, that they're kind of steering us in the wrong direction, what I call a kind of Midas mindset. You all kind of know the King Midas story. And actually, I should acknowledge here that my wife is the person who recommended this idea of the Midas mindset to me. Of course, the thought with Midas is that what really matters is gold, not love, in a sense. And he gets, you know, into some trouble with this notion. But the idea is that our elites today are often kind of stressing the importance of money, the importance of work, the importance of education, the importance of kind of building your own brand. That's sort of where the path is going to lead to prosperity and happiness for ordinary Americans. And this kind of was brought home to me one night finishing up the book project. And I was, you know, working on an edit and was getting distracted by looking on Twitter because there was a headline that was trending on Twitter from Bloomberg News. And this headline told us that, quote, women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer, okay? And it told us that foregoing marriage and parenthood is a bigger payoff for American women, okay? So the claim here empirically was, and I'll come back to this in a second because it's false, important to note here, but the kind of the claim was that basically steering clear of marriage and motherhood for women was the sort of path to prosperity. But that wasn't the only message embedded in this Bloomberg story. The other message in this Bloomberg story, which was just told kind of in story form, was that women who were steering clear of marriage and motherhood were kind of just living their best life. That they were incredibly happy, incredibly fulfilled. Every single childless woman in this Bloomberg story was just totally living her best life, including this woman here, Ashley, who is splitting time between properties in Manhattan and the Jersey Shore, doing a lot of travel, you know, just kind of living that that Midas mindset lifestyle. And she says in her own words, I love my life and feel very fulfilled. Okay, so clearly there was a lot of work being done here. And if you had any doubts about kind of the author's agenda. On the day that she published this piece in Bloomberg, she tweeted out some tweet where she was kind of, you know, that figure on Twitter that has like the dancing woman in red. She's like, this is for all my like female childless friends. So clearly she had an agenda here. So, okay, I'm giving you one example from Bloomberg. Is this really emblematic of anything, right? You might ask if you're more skeptical of the kind of argument that I'm making. Well, I think it's actually pretty emblematic of a lot of media messaging around marriage and motherhood. That we're kind of getting a lot of anti-nuptial and anti-natal messages from me. This is the Atlantic making the case against marriage. Okay, it's pretty anti-nuptial. This is the New York Times kind of making the case for a needless divorce. The woman even acknowledges in this piece that her husband's like a good guy, that she kind of loved him, but she just wants more freedom, basically. And so she leaves him. Okay, so this is the stuff we're getting from the mainstream left. I don't think anyone here is kind of surprised to have someone like me kind of chronicling some of the problems with the mainstream progressive messaging around marriage and family. Okay. But what's interesting today is that we're now getting kind of similar messages from the online right that are also going after marriage and parenthood. But where the left is kind of focusing on women, sort of saying that for women, this is a bad deal, getting married and having kids. Who is the online right targeting with their anti-marriage message? Men, exactly. Okay, so this is kind of a new thing. We're getting hit from all sides here in our culture. And I call it the red pill right. People like Pearl Davis here on the left and Andrew Tate here on the right are telling us that marriage is a bad deal for guys. There's kind of no return on the investment for men. This is articulated in this. I'm not going to play it, but you can kind of come to this video and hear Andrew Tate kind of inveighing against marriage today from men. And he's a very kind of, you know, in some ways persuasive and powerful speaker. And I was in Utah, of all places, just 2 weeks ago, speaking to a group of primarily, you know, teenagers at an LDS school in Utah. And I asked them about Andrew Tate, and there were a lot of sheepish smiles from the teenage boys in this room, again, in Utah with a predominantly Mormon group. Okay, so Andrew Tate and this kind of messaging is definitely out there among a lot of our teenage boys. My own teenage son kind of acknowledged that he's very much aware of the Tate perspective, you know, from his circles and his internet meanderings. Okay, so this is kind of what we're facing, is that basically the left and the right, in some ways, or certain kind of portions of the left and the right, are telling us the path to prosperity and happiness run away from marriage and family, not towards them. So I think this is part and parcel of why we're seeing what I'm calling the closing of the American heart unfolding right now in our country and our culture. And what I mean by this notion of the American heart closing is that the elite messaging that we're getting, and we're also kind of seeing expressed oftentimes in social media, is helping to push Americans, young adults especially, as Mark was saying, away from marriage and family, away from kind of our most fundamental social institution that gives us kids, that gives us kin, that gives us financial stability, even more importantly, so many opportunities, not just to be cared for, but to give of ourselves, to make that gift of self, to obviously quote from St. John Paul the Great. So empirically, what is it that I'm talking about this morning? What is kind of the trends? And I'm piggybacking here on Mark. We didn't actually plan this particular piece out, but it's, you know, it's clear that the marriage rate's fallen by about 65% since 1970, the year that I was born. And I would actually, I would raise the number that Mark just shared with you to 1 in 3. Okay, so what we're projecting now is that for 20-somethings today, so for the students kind of who are at this university and their peers broadly kind of described, about 1 in 3 of them will never marry. We've never been in this demographic territory before, where so many of our young adults will end up in midlife and later life without the benefit of a spouse. And that, of course, has implications for childbearing, obviously, because even today, marriage is still a big driver of fertility, of childbearing. We're seeing the fertility rate in this country fall to about 1.6 right now. And my colleague Lyman Stone, who's a demographer, is projecting further declines for the United States in the near future. So again, these are marks of this closing of the American heart that's unfolding. And what this means practically for young adults is that at least probably 1 in 4 young adults today will never have children. And again, we've never had this kind of pattern playing out where there are going to be so many folks who don't have the experience, the struggles, the stresses, but the joys of becoming a father, of becoming a mother for our 20-somethings today. We get a kind of an inkling of sort of what this means when we look across the Pacific Ocean. And what we're seeing in places like China and Japan is what's been called kind of the bare branches phenomenon or pattern here in China, where there are lots of adults who are living without a spouse and any children, okay? And we know this is linked in Japan, for instance, where it's sort of been pioneered. I call it the land of the setting sun, not, of course, the rising sun. It's linked to economic stagnation. It's linked to a lot of public debt for Japan. But it's also linked to a profound increase in loneliness for older Japanese adults. And there was a kind of a harrowing story in the 2019 New York Times that was talking about sort of how this is playing out in Japan. And it told us that there was a generation of older Japanese women and men living in, quote, extreme isolation, often left to live and die alone in their final years. So in the words of that New York Times story, kind of talking about this dynamic unfolding, this bare branches pattern unfolding in Japan, they said this, quote, "The isolation of elderly Japanese is so common that an entire industry has emerged around it, specializing in cleaning out apartments where decomposing remains are found." So whereas these people are so isolated and alone in later life that they don't have people regularly visiting. They don't have, obviously, a spouse with them. They don't have adult children. They don't have grandkids kind of coming around. And so this is kind of like the end of the road for Japan. They've lost more than 500,000 people in terms of population last year. It just kind of gives us a sense of what happens if we can't kind of reopen the American heart, potentially. Now, of course, when you talk about these kinds of trends, as Mark and I do a good bit, there are plenty of voices in the culture who would say, well, you know what, it doesn't really matter that marriage, for instance, is in decline. I'm thinking of the NYU sociologist Eric Klinenberg wrote a book called Going Solo. And in an interview with the New York Times, he could not muster a negative word about the falling marriage rate in America. He said, for young professionals, being single is a sign of success and a mark of distinction, a way to gain freedom and experience the anonymity that can make city life so exhilarating. Okay, so again, this is kind of how many of our elites are responding to this unfolding trend when it comes to marriage in America. But my perspective, obviously, is pretty different than Eric Klinenberg's. Because I would say that in a nation where we're seeing rising economic inequality, where too many of us are, what I would say, are addicted to electronic opiates, where many adults, particularly younger adults, are saying that they're beset by loneliness. And again, where many of us, particularly, again, younger adults, are unmoored by what I would describe as a kind of rising normlessness, you know, not kind of having their lives governed by some key conventions. It's in this economic, technological, social, and normative context that I would suggest to you, it's not just that marriage and family matter for us and our kids and our young adults, they matter more than ever. This is my hypothesis, okay? In an increasingly anomic world, having the benefit of a spouse and kids to care for and then care for you when you're older becomes that much more valuable. But empirically, what's the case? Well, we're seeing, for instance, when it comes to college graduation, you've got a picture of my university here in the middle of the slide, UVA. What we're seeing is that, yes, kids who are raised as boomers, in yellow bar families, intact families, were more likely to graduate from college compared to their peers in non-intact families in the blue bar. But that relationship has become even stronger for millennials. So we've got some evidence here that it's not just that marriage matters for our kids, it matters more than ever when it comes to college graduation. We see the same pattern playing out, for instance, when it comes to school suspensions for high schoolers. Okay, that the benefit of coming from an intact married family when you've got both your parents in the household is stronger now than it was 16 years ago in a different data set. We see another kind of study on sort of economic stress showing the same pattern. So again, what I'm saying is for kids, it's not just that marriage matters today, it's that it matters more than ever for their well-being. But what about adults? What's the story there for men and women? Because as Mark was kind of, I think, suggesting, there are a lot of folks becoming more ambivalent or concerned about marriage. Well, financially, we're seeing the kind of the benefit financially in terms of your household income is growing relative to being unmarried for, you know, contemporary adults versus adults who are kind of coming up in the 70s when I was a kid. Okay, so again, financially, the benefits of putting a ring on it, or to quote from my book, of getting married, are bigger now than they were when I was born back in 1970. But what about this happiness thing that I began our time with this morning? Where does the happiness story kind of play out for adults today? And I mentioned this in part because when I talk to UVA students, when I talk to my colleagues at UVA, the message I get from a lot of UVA students is, I'm going to focus on my education, I'm going to focus on my work. This is part and parcel of what Mark was describing as the capstone model. And then maybe at some point I'm going to focus on getting married. But their priority is this kind of Midas mindset, this education, this work, this income orientation. And there's not kind of like a lot of thinking among at least my UVA students about how their lives could be oriented towards love and marriage in some kind of near-term way. They kind of think that the most important thing at some level is especially a good job. And they're not alone, because a lot of different Pew polls are telling us that Americans, and even parents now, unfortunately, thinking about their kids, are prioritizing education, money, and especially work as what they think are the most likely drivers of happiness, of meaning, of fulfillment, okay, as this Pew data tell us, okay? But what does the social science research or data tell us about what is most likely to drive happiness for ordinary women and men across the US? Well, it turns out that nothing compares to really marriage when it comes to the pursuit of happiness, you know, that Jeffersonian phrase that I mentioned at the beginning. So again, the culture tells us that it's about education, it's about money, it's about work. But the data tell us a different story. So my book, for instance, kind of looks at the relationship between education, money, work, just being married, and being in a good marriage here in green. And you can see here, if you look closely, it's probably hard for folks in the back, but yes, getting a college degree at a university like the one we're in boosts your odds of happiness by 64%. Having a higher than average income boosts your odds of happiness by 88%. Having a good job boosts your happiness by about 145%. So it's not kind of, you know, it's not wrong to think about things like education, work, and money, but just simply being married is even more powerful predictor for ordinary folks of being very happy with their lives. And then being in a good marriage boosts your odds of being very happy by 545%. Okay. And what's, I think, noteworthy about this statistic here is that in the general social survey, the GSS that Mark and I have looked at over the years, there's no variable that compares to marital quality. Again, not money, not work, not sexual frequency, not self-rated health, not even religious attendance. This is the biggest factor for ordinary Americans in predicting whether or not they're very happy with their lives, okay? And this is not obviously kind of a finding that gets a lot of attention in our contemporary pop culture and in the media and in our schools and universities in the main. Mentioned we kind of flip the equation a little bit and think about what are the trends in unhappiness, as we're seeing more and more Americans report that they're unhappy in this country and this culture. What this is kind of showing us is the folks who are unmarried are this top line right here, and the folks who are married are this bottom line here, aged 18 to 55. So kind of the epidemic, if you will, of unhappiness is concentrated more among unmarried Americans than it is married Americans. So I'm thinking, for instance, of women like Taylor, a woman from the Rocky Mountain West who I profile in the book. And she kind of prioritized the Midas mindset in her 20s, or she prioritized kind of the mammon over marriage in her 20s. And now she's having second thoughts about this. She says, as a young woman, she was told, don't get married too young, go out and see the world and do all these other things, and don't get attached to anyone too quickly. She took this advice and pursued a career in digital marketing in her 20s, rather than kind of dating with an eye to getting married in her 20s. Now, though, she's wondering about this strategy. She says, I look back on that advice and I'm like, you know, if I could do it again, I would actually focus on finding a husband a little bit more. She says, I don't have like a ton of meaning in my life right now. And she also says the time that she spends babysitting for her nieces and nephews, time that she loves, has left her thinking that she would have been more fulfilled if she were married with kids. She says, the older I get, you know, I wonder if there's a chance that I could have a family of my own right now, you know, do fun things with them, finger paint, whatever. I don't know what kids do, okay? So there's a lot of regret in Taylor's in mind right now as a sort of mid-30-something woman about kind of how she focused more on career rather than on trying to find a spouse and have kids, you know, in her 20s. Now, of course, I think everyone here knows there are plenty of single adults who are flourishing. But I'm just saying that on average, this kind of rise in unhappiness that we're seeing play out in the US is concentrated among unmarried, both men and women. And it's often, I think, not reflected in a lot of the coverage of marriage and family and motherhood that we see in our media and other cultural domains. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to kind of go through the entirety of Catherine's story, but it's kind of a contrast to Taylor's story. Catherine's a married mother of two in Virginia. She's Catholic, and she just talks about how kind of her life is more difficult now with two young kids. She's expecting her third child actually now, because the care of, you know, young kids forces her to, she says, really die to myself and become more selfless. Talks about she's got less time to go eating out, less time to follow her favorite female bloggers. So in their sacrifices about being a married mom, you know, for Catherine. But as she kind of puts things into a broader perspective, she says that she's kind of feels more compassionate, more charitable, and more connected as both a wife and mother. And that from her perspective, quote, I think there's a deeper fulfillment there when it comes to being a married mom for Catherine. And again, her kind of experience is actually typical of sort of how women in general would kind of report when it comes to happiness, because what we see in the data and the GSS is that there's no group of women or men 18 to 55 who are happier than married fathers and married mothers. Again, you don't really going to get that fact pattern reported on the mainstream media, but it is what we see in the data. And Catherine's kind of an example of the more positive story. So what I'm suggesting to you today is that kind of the path to prosperity and happiness actually runs through marriage and family. And I'm not trying to kind of paint a rose-colored portrait here. Today, or in my book, I kind of acknowledge that there are many stresses and strains and sacrifices that most of us experience as spouses and parents. But just when you kind of compare the reality of family life to the reality of kind of lifelong singledom, what you see is that for most of us, we're more likely to flourish in this sort of this social, this communal context that is, you know, the family. Okay, so having made this point, what do we do with all of this? Okay. How do we think about ways to kind of reverse the closing of the American heart? How do we kind of make marriage and family life more appealing and more accessible to ordinary young adults? So one thing is to think about how we can create a culture that's more conducive to flourishing for young men and teenage boys. Because one of the things that I hear from my UVA women is that they feel like a lot of the guys in their social circles are not flourishing. They're not responsible. They're not worthy of commitment. They're not interested in commitment. They don't really have a sense of, clear identity. They don't kind of give them confidence as potential, spouses, husbands. So what do we do? Well, I think we can encourage our teenage boys and young men to be more deliberate about kind of discerning their gifts, figuring out kind of what they're good at and how that might link to some kind of career, and being very explicit too, with apologies to our hosts today, that probably most young men should not go to college, but there are many good technical tracks that they could sort of pursue and do well at professionally. But for those who are kind of heading towards college, or obviously in college, kind of taking that more seriously, again, we do see that women tend to do better in high school and college. And that's in part, I think, a reflection of the ways in which a lot of young men are not taking high school or some kind of trade school or college seriously enough. And then too, to kind of embrace a sense of like their vocation, that they're called to do something meaningful and powerful as men in the workplace. And this will kind of give them obviously a better income over time and a sense of self-identity that makes them more attractive to potential partners and spouses down the road. But kind of just think about ways we kind of can build up men's connection to education, to the trades, and then to stronger start professionally in the early 20s. That in doing these things, men will benefit in terms of have a better sense of their own self-identity, and teenage boys as well. And they'll become more attractive to the girls and women in their lives in ways that will make them, better husbands down the road. So part of the work we have to do is trying to, basically help young men, man up. Okay, so the second thought here, and this goes to Mark's comments about online dating, is that my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, has looked at just the association between kind of where you met someone and how happy you are in your marriage. This is for folks who are 18 to 35 in this IFS study that Wendy Wang did for us. And what you can see here, if you're close to the screen, and this is probably good news for everyone here, is that the folks who are the most happy in their marriages are folks who met in some kind of religious context. Could be at church, it could be kind of a youth group, could be a college ministry, whatever. Okay, so clearly folks who are meeting in a religious context are the ones most likely to be flourishing in their marriages today. Then it's some kind of like social events, a party of some sort with friends, probably. Then it's, as my wife and I did, we met at the University of Virginia, meeting in college. That's the third kind of most kind of positive pattern here. Then at work, then just through friends, then family, then online. And then the bottom category here is in a bar or restaurant. So something about meeting in a bar, some of you may have been in a bar, but hopefully you're the exception here. But I think one other way to think about this too is just that we are incarnational creatures, right? And so having the opportunity to kind of meet someone in person, get to know them in a variety of ways in person ends up being probably more helpful than just, kind of scrolling through some kind of, dating app and trying to figure out from that context. And again, I have good friends in Charlottesville who are married through dating apps and doing well. But I'm just saying, in general, if we could think about more ways to cultivate that in-person meet, that would be great. The third thing here is, again, for kind of the young men and the young men in your lives to sort of think about, ruminate, is to encourage them to, quote, ask her out, right? And I'm thinking here of a story that was told by Arthur Brooks, who is now a professor at Harvard. He was the head of the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, where I have an affiliation, think tank in Washington, D.C. And he talks about being actually a musician in his early 20s, and he was traveling through Europe, played an event in Barcelona, and he happened to see this woman Esther, who really caught his fancy. And he asked her out. He was brave, he was concrete, and he was persistent. He talks about it in this way. He says, of course, having met her, I had to convince Esther. So I tackled the project as if it were a startup. I began by studying Spanish. I didn't even know her language. Before long, I quit my job and moved to her native Barcelona, where I knew no one except her in hot pursuit. The market pressure was intense. Men would shout wedding proposals to her from moving cars. But I pressed on, undeterred. It took 2 years to close the deal, but she finally said yes, and we married. Okay. And you got, other quotes from him on that. Now, obviously, not all of us guys are as sort of, talented as Arthur Brooks is. He's a very talented guy. Great speaker, great thinker, great writer, writes for The Atlantic now, a great musician. But the point I'm trying to make here for us ordinary male mortals is that we need to kind of take that initiative. And why am I saying this should be kind of the guy taking that initiative? Well, we see from a social science perspective is that women perceive this, one, as a sign of genuine interest in them, okay? Secondly, they kind of either explicitly or implicitly kind of appreciate that it takes a certain measure of courage to ask them out. And courage in men is actually pretty appreciated by women. And then third, I think it kind of basically takes at least some part of, in a sense, the relationship responsibility and puts it on kind of the male shoulders. Whereas particularly today, a lot of the responsibilities for relationships tend to kind of run with the young women. So, and we actually see that between 80 and 90% of women who are asked about this issue of who you like to ask first, the guy or the gal, when it comes to making that first move, women report in overwhelming numbers they would prefer that the guy would make that first move. Okay, so I would just encourage men to ask women out, understanding that sometimes you're going to fall flat on your face, and then you just move on. Okay, the fourth thing, we're almost done here. I know people are probably hungry for lunch, is don't live together. And this is, as you probably can gather, I'm teaching at a public university in Virginia, and I'm probably the most conservative professor. I'm sure the most, that they are exposed to at UVA. And I tell them a lot of things that are surprising to them and controversial to them. But this is the most controversial thing and surprising thing that I tell my students, because almost all of them think that, the way you should prepare for marriage is to live with someone. And it makes sense, right? Like if you want to be a good soccer player, you do a lot of practice. If you want to be a good teacher, you get a lot of practice in front of a classroom. If you want to be a good piano player, you play the piano a lot. So you would think when it comes to marriage, the best way to prepare for marriage is to try out the relationship in a co-residential context. But what we're seeing in a lot of different studies is that that's actually not a good idea. Because those who are marrying directly, for instance, in their 20s, actually tend to be happier, more sexually satisfied, and less likely to get divorced than their peers who are having multiple relationships with people that also might include cohabitation. Just going to give you one figure that kind of illustrates the point here. This is from a Stanford scholar, Professor Rosenfeld at Stanford in sociology, who is not a conservative, I can assure you, but he is an empirical, family sociologist. And what he's doing here is just sort of graphing out women's risk of divorce. And this is purple, where you're cohabiting with someone besides your first husband and your first husband. And this is green, where you're cohabiting with someone besides your husband. And then this is just sort of no cohabitation in blue, or cohabiting with your husband here in red. It's kind of like, in some ways, like what we would in the Catholic tradition call like a natural marriage back in the day, many centuries ago. But the point here simply is that when you cohabit with someone who's not your spouse, your risk of divorce, in this case for women, it's also true basically for men, increases dramatically. And we're not entirely sure why that's the case. My own hypothesis is that it kind of fosters kind of an insidious comparison, right? So I'm married to John, and John's a really great guy, but he's not as sort of charismatic as David. He's not as ambitious as William. He's not as romantic as Charles, right? So that's, I think, the dynamic that maybe kind of help to explain, but just something about having multiple cohabiting partners prior to marriage that puts you at risk of much higher likelihood of landing in divorce court. So the story here is to encourage folks not to live together, but instead to be more intentional about, dating with an eye towards marriage. And you can find out a lot about your potential spouse by doing things like volunteering at a homeless shelter or working with, big brothers or big sisters, and, the list goes on. And the final thing, appropriately enough, here is just to kind of make a plug for shared faith for our young adults when it comes to steering onto a path of marital success. And even today, a lot of young adults, particularly younger women, kind of think about marriage, I would say, and love in overly romanticized terms that kind of embrace what I would call like the soulmate myth. It's all about that butterfly feeling in your stomach when you first meet someone, you're first with someone. You kind of have this idea that this is going to be we're going to be in cloud nine, sort of from here on out. But by contrast, for people who are kind of embedded in a faith community, hopefully get a bit more realistic vision of like what marriage is all about and the challenges that attend to marriage. And even more importantly, they come to understand that marriage is not about kind of that butterfly feeling, as good as that can be for us. It's about willing the good of the other, obviously, to kind of paraphrase St. Thomas Aquinas. And so marriage is an opportunity for us to grow in love, both for our spouse and for our children and for our kin. And that people who have a common faith in America today are more likely to embrace the sort of more family-first approach to marriage and love that ends up being not only more stable, but also actually more conducive to fulfillment and happiness kind of over the long term in their marriages. So taking steps like the ones that I've just articulated can put one on the road not only to marrying, but to forging the kind of strong and stable marriage that's most likely to give us, to give you, to give young adults in general a shot at that classic American pursuit that Jefferson articulated in the Declaration, that is the pursuit of happiness. And more importantly, I would say also, and this comes to the bottom part of my subtitle here, is that by embracing marriage and family, by opening your heart to marry love, you can do your own part to save our civilization. So thank you.